Welcome back, everyone. I'm happy to introduce the next program tonight. John Dunn and Lara Tseng will be talking about shorebird identification in a workshop format. Members of WFO, of course, are familiar with John and know of his passion for teaching about field identification, status, and distribution. John has been on the board of WFO for over 20 years and is our current president. As most of you know, John is the co-author of the 7th edition of the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of North America and was either the co-author or chief consultant for the previous editions. He is currently serving on the AOS Committee on Classification and Nomenclature and spent over 30 years on the California Bird Records Committee. In 2012, John was a recipient of the ABA's Roger Torrey Peterson Award, given for a lifetime of achievements in promoting the cause of birding. John has many publications on birds, too long to list, including a variety of books and including videos on the gulls of North America, birds of Southern California, a book that was mentioned in a presentation just earlier with Kimball Garrett, and one of my favorites, the Peterson Field Guide to Warblers, also written with Kimball. Lara is an avid young birder from Southern California. She lives in Orange County. She has a number of publications, including one in our newsletter, and she's also written for the North American Bluebird Society's Bluebird Journal. She developed an interest in shorebirds and recently gave a presentation for, I think that was for Mount Diablo Audubon Society on the subspecies of dunlins, which some of you may have seen. So with that, I'll turn it over to John and Lara for their workshop on shorebird identification.
Thank you all. I got to make sure our program is ready. Perfect. Just a few background words. Laura will primarily not be speaking, but she'll be kind of like the Wizard of Oz, the young person or the person behind the curtain, maneuvering the controls, including the cursor, pointing out various things, was an active participant. This is a collaboration of the two of us. Laura did the PowerPoint, including the beautiful artistic images behind the background, including some of her own that she created. So an artist in the real world. And many of the beautiful photographs you'll see are from Larry Sansoni, who has long collaborated on many of my programs. When I started thinking of the amount of time we have, and I wanted to allow lots of time for questions, as well as a bio break, I whittled yellowlegs out pretty quickly, and I suspect we will not get to dowitchers. I'm sorry, they are on the program. We will see. I would direct you to a lab. It might cost $20 to become a member, but John Feenstra did a very good program on tringas, which would include the yellowlegs, and there is also an archive program on dowitchers that one can watch too. So let's see where we get. After having watched Bryce and Bryce's method of presentation, I tried my hand at the flicker. Kimball said in the chat that there was a flicker of hope for me. So with those few crumbs of inspiration, when I was younger, I would have passed those by, but as you age, you embrace them. I'm going to try a slower approach and hopefully allow lots of time for questions as we go along. So let's start with the first image. Well, I always start off with any program is learning status and distribution. Chance favors the prepared mind, as Pasteur is alleged to have said more than a century ago. Learning the timing of the spring migration, which birds sometimes winter or winter in good numbers, as opposed to those that are through migrants, the timing of the fall migration of the adults and of the juveniles, and knowing that in almost all species, the adults come through first, followed by the juveniles. In many species, the males seem to come first, followed by the females come first, followed by the males. Although other than structural mensural differences, it's often hard to tell the adults. You've got to think basically 3 plumages. Basic equals or winter plumage, alternate or breeding plumage, and juvenile or juvenile plumage. I still like the adjective juvenile, although juvenile, the ILE is being used throughout. And don't forget that there is a downy young plumage you see on the breeding plumage, and on the breeding grounds. This is a baby Dunlin. So, but we don't see those. Those do not migrate for obvious reasons. So they're in juvenile plumage by the time they leave. Going on, next. Part of becoming a better shorebirder is how to look at shorebirds. More is not better. Find a place that has a few shorebirds that you can look at carefully, very carefully. Don't go to a place with thousands of shorebirds that get easily alarmed and you look at them from a distance. Find a place that you can see them well. This may be a small pond and may only have 30 birds that will rotate and be different from day to day or every few days. Beware as you approach of killdeer and blackneck stilts, sometimes referred to slightly in a disparaging manner as marsh poodles. That will disturb the other shorebirds. A peregrine or a merlin can clear the field. When I'm carefully looking at shorebirds, I am not keen to see those, particularly a peregrine. Learn feather topography and observe behavior. That's often just as important as other means. Learn the vocalizations. Watch feeding territories. They will form flocks, especially when alarmed, but then will separate into their own feeding territory. Always when you look at a bird, think of its age, especially in the fall, which is fun because you have birds that are molting. The adults are adults in breeding plumage, and plus the juveniles, and birds that are largely in basic plumage. The identifying a rarity should always be carefully done, especially if it is not refound. So if the flock gets up and goes, it should sort itself back out. If you get a quick look at a bird, you're convinced it's a rare bird, you want to reconfirm and reconfirm and reconfirm. If you don't see it again, that's the first major warning sign that you might have made a mistake. And lastly, especially when the juvenile's about, make a point of sort of integrating yourself with the birds. They are, you can become one with them, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Just work out very gradually. If allowed, perhaps just take your shoes off, and if the mud is firm, you can just kind of stroll slowly. They get used to you. You're not a threat. I've literally had juveniles come within a few feet of me. I can't say they've walked between my legs yet, but I'm waiting for that experience. And when you're only looking at 10, 12 birds, you can just relax rather than panicking about not seeing a rarity and see them well. So next image. Perfect. Now this is Jonathan Aldifer's illustration of a semi-palmated sandpiper. There's a lot of feather groups there. I won't linger on eye and bill and legs, or tibia tarsus. It's the feather groups above that cause the most consternation. And we'll look at this for a bit and then go to live examples to see how they interpret. So I always start at the rear of the bird, separating the tail and the primary tip projection. The primary tip projection is very important, and a few species show no primary tip projection, or virtually none, like least and some dowitchers. So the primary tip projection is either short, and it's rather short and semi-palmated, almost negligible in least, to very noticeable as in bears. The next group of feathers up work up from the primary tip projection to the three tertials. And they are all often very important for identification. They're kind of saber-shaped. Many people confuse them with the primaries. The greater secondary coverts, or greater coverts, are the next group up. They're graders because they're larger, and there's one group. And they're up from the tertials. So we get lost, go back to the primary tip projection, then the tertials, then the greater coverts. And the next row are the medians. One row of those, and then multiple rows of lesser coverts. But they're often obscured by the scapulars, which hang over the lesser coverts, or not. Sometimes they're trimmed back, as well as the contour for the small feathers, the white feathers on the underparts on this juvenile bird can obscure the lesser coverts. So the back involves relatively a smaller area, fewer feathers. You want to look, this species usually does not show a split supercilium or a double supercilium, but often it's very important to get involved in the feathers of the coverts and the tertials and all of that, as well as gauging the primary tip projection. Next image. So let's take a species with fairly long primary tip projection, and in honor of the very fine program we saw on the buffies, the buff-breasted sandpiper. This is a juvenile, fairly long primary tip projection, indicative of a species that might go to South America, so they have very long wings, as opposed to least, which doesn't, with hardly any primary tip projection. You'll see up from that primary tip projection the obvious tertials. The middle one is longer than the one either side of it. And then the greater secondary coverts, or greater coverts, and the medians, and the lessers, of which I see one row, and the tips of the next row. And notice the different pattern of the larger scapulars. Now the scapulars can be further divided into the smaller inner scapulars versus the outer or lower scapulars, which are larger and typically 5 rows. And then you can see the back or mantle. Now, if this all seems tedious, you can look at the just images and photos and books and practice, and start with the primary tip projection. Don't get confused with the tail below it, which is sometimes largely obscure. Next image. So back to our semi-palmated, which was the line illustration. We have the primary tip projection, the tail below it, the tertials, the greater coverts. I see 2 and a bit of a third. And I'm not sure if I'm seeing medians because they're sort of hidden by the feathers on the underparts. And everything else I see on this bird are scapulars plus the mantle. And even some of the part of the lower row of scapulars is obscured. For those who get into this, this actually gets to be quite a lot of fun identifying the feathers. And it'll help you when you see birds farther away. If you look at them up close and personal, get used to them, then at a slightly more of a distance, the patterns will more quickly reveal themselves. Next image. So here's another long distance migrant, pectoral sandpiper. Some breed west to Timer, and those adults, most of them at least, migrate some 2,500 or more miles east to Alaska, another 2,500 miles east to Hudson Bay or so, and then south all the way to Argentina. So it's not surprising that the primary tip projection is very long. I think those pectoral sandpipers migrate farther than Arctic terns. Here again, you can see the tertials, the greater coverts, the medians, one row of medians, and all the rows of lesser coverts are shown because here the scapulars are all bunched up. Next image. Another long distance migrant going to South America is the Bairds. Unlike the pectoral, it's more striped. We'll talk about it. It's Baird, juvenile Bairds, which we see most of, are very scaly. So notice that. The white rumped is quite similar in the overall structure. And the primary tip projection gets very long or long wings. And notice the wing tips extend well beyond the tail. It gives it more of a horizontal body stance to the ground. Next image. I'm just showing this image of a least sandpiper with its wings spread. And here you get a sense about where the scapulars are and where the tertials are. And much of that spread wing is hidden up on the folded wing. You can see the primary coverts and also the alula, other feather groups you don't see. And I don't encourage you to memorize what you're seeing when the wing spreads, but just get a sense of what you're seeing on the folded wing. Next image. So, do we have any comments so far? And I'll make a correction that Andy Birch did the Tringa talk, and also that programs are free to the public to see, or at least the ones that have been given. I'm sure Susan will further correct this situation if I have in any way misstated that, but we're grateful to them. Any questions come in yet?
So far, there is nothing in the Q&A.
Well, there we are. Then why don't we move on to the next image. So starting with the smaller calidris, which will be the focus initially of our talk, our 3 North American species and the 4 Old World species known as stints. Let's start with the 2 common ones. Always start with the common species. Learn those absolutely cold. And in our case, on the Pacific coast, those 2 are least in Western sandpiper. There's no point in even thinking about seeing a rare stand if you can't really tell leasts and Westerns. You've got to learn those cold. Leasts are much more widespread in the winter. Westerns are pretty confined to tidal coastal estuaries, fairly large ones. Even a place like Malibu Lagoon, where the redneck stint is not a particularly good place to see winter Westerns. They're common at the Salton Sea. Also, they winter on Owens Lake, maybe in Kings County, but otherwise, Western sandpipers are pretty rare in the interior of California in the winter. Where the 2 occur together, they often separate out by feeding niche. The calls are distinct. They're fairly easy to identify by size and structure, especially bill structure, and most times, or nearly all times, especially in the winter, by coloration. One thing you need to wean yourself from is looking at the legs. I can't tell you the number of times I said, but we can't see the legs, or what about the legs? They're so easy to identify without looking at the legs, and the legs get slimy, muddy stuff on them, which changes the color. And again, note my comment about not identifying other peeps till you learn least and westerns. Absolutely in your sleep. You should be dreaming of the differences between those two. Next image. So here in the winter, for instance, you have a western in the foreground and a least in the background. Look how strikingly different the color is. One is brown with a brown wash across the breast. One is gray above that's white underneath. You can see the difference in the bills, but why would you worry about the legs? Next image. So that's the way they are in basic. And they'll keep that plumage through the winter, and then when they get going north, they're usually mostly or entirely in breeding plumage. The coloration isn't quite as distinct, but you can see the bill structure difference. That's a western in the middle, alternate western with the least on either side. Western a little paler underneath, pattern of spotting is different. Look at the bill difference and the coloration, the scapulars. Next image. So here's a close-up western in breeding plumage. And a little tidbit on how it got its scientific name. Look at the bright rufous on the crown, ear coverts, and on the scapulars, including the rufous base to the outer scapulars. It's a good picture of the bill. And look at the extensive streaking below and the character of streaks with arrow-shaped spots. Moving on. And here's a close-up of an alternate least. They can get somewhat brighter than this, but this gives you the general idea. The bill is slightly decurved, but is certainly quite thin and shorter than the western. Lacks the rufous and the ear coverts and crown and base of the scapulars, the bright rufous. The difference in the streaking below, finer streaks, not as extensive. The size is obvious when the two are together. Remember the feeding niches. Next image. So here you can actually see, because the legs are washed, the leg color, which you're to ignore. But semi-palmated and western are the two species that have partial webbing between the toes. The other 5 small calidris lack it. They also, and you can almost see it, they all have hind toes. The sanderling lacks that. Next image. A comparison. Breeding plumage least, breeding plumage western. Both are very common as migrants. Least is in addition pretty widespread in the winter, western more localized. So I always want to be thinking about status and distribution. When you think about migrations in these species, and I'll just give western as an example, the fall migration, the first adults are migrating south by the last week of June. And that migration continues to the middle of August for the adults. Juveniles arrive the last few days of July, particularly first week of August, and continue through till mid-October. So there's a bit of overlap with the adults and juveniles in early August, and particularly a place where none winter, like in Death Valley, you can really see how the migration goes on. And so the fall migration for a western sandpiper is from late June to mid-October, almost half the year, but you're getting different ages. Next image. Something I've become to appreciate a little more during my several decades, too many decades of shorebird study, is that when they come back south in the fall, they're more worn, and in almost all cases appear a little darker than they did in the spring. So here is a worn breeding adult western sandpiper in mid-July, and a least worn adult least sandpiper in also, well, actually on the same date in July, so just darker. I just note, if a photographer's not identified, they're Larry Sansonis. Next image. On to juvenile plumage. When the juvenile westerns come down at the end of July, first few days of August, from the worn adults, they stick out like a sore thumb. One, they mirror the winter plumage or basic plumage, basically being pale underneath, but look at all that color above. And with those worn adults, they stand out like a sore thumb. The adult westerns in worn breeding plumage are already beginning to molt to basic plumage, so sort of a patchy appearance. Look at the bright chestnut edges on the inner scapulars there. And they kind of show anchor marks on the outer scapulars, grayer at the base, with a black anchor there. The coverts themselves, these are so fresh, they do have color on the edges, but they're not as filled in as dark as they are on a semi-palmated sandpiper. And look at the bill. The bill starts off kind of thick and then thins and maybe slightly thicker at the tip. Next image. And here's the juvenile least. First thing to notice is the breast is brownish or wash brownish with some streaks. It's not as white. If the middle tertial were to drop, there'd be almost no primary tip projection. And the color is not as chestnutty. It's more rusty for the brightness on the inner scapulars. Next image. Here's a comparison. Juvenile western on the left, juvenile east on the right. I'll start off with just look at the underparts. Next image. And back to basic plumage. Here's a basic least on the left, showing the brown wash across the throat and the dark color. Notice that mud on the legs. The legs can appear black, but look how easy they are to tell on color. Next image. So that brings our third small calidris, North American calidris, that's very common over the eastern 2/3 of North America, particularly the eastern half. It breeds all across the Arctic, all the way to western Alaska, the Seward Peninsula, but is, I'd say, rare in the spring, or very rare to very uncommon in the fall. Most of what we see in the fall are juveniles. We do see a few in the spring. The best field mark on semi-palmated sandpiper is the bill. Thick, stubby, tubular. And they have a mean look to the face because they get dark around the lower, sort of a black-eyed appearance, or black, I don't want to say like they're punched in the eye, but with a distinct supercilium. Now this is an alternate semi-palmated sandpiper or breeding plumage. Notice it lacks the bright rufous on crown, ear coverts, and scapulars, and the streaking is finer and not as extensive as a western that has those arrow-shaped spots. But in all plumages, from least and western, the best feature is that stubby, short, thick bill. Next image. So here's a comparison. Western on the right, semi-palmated in the middle, least on the left in fresh alternate plumage. Next image. Now the juvenile semi-palmated can show a bit of rust on the inner scapulars, but not so much that chestnut color of a Western. Look how dark it is around the eye. That really sets off that supercilium. The primary projection is fairly short, but longer than least, much like Western. Typically not with a split supercilium, but the colors are not as contrasty as in a Western, and I always look first for that bill. This is a particularly bright, fresh bird. Others don't look as bright as this. They tend to feed out a bit into the water like Westerns, but not deep into the water, so right along the shore. The three species kind of parse their own habitat on the mudflats. Next image. In comparison now of the juveniles of least semi-palmated and Western. The darker face of the semi-palmated. Now, at least for California, the best time to see semi-palmated sandpiper, and often you want to look at the first juveniles that are occurring either the last few days of July, particularly the first 10 days of August. By the 15th of August, the great majority of even the juvenile semi-palmated sandpipers have gone through. Yes, there are lingering records into September, a few even later, but I'm afraid, as the Dodgers said year after year, wait till next year before we see semi-palmated. Semi-palmateds were thought to winter in good numbers on the Gulf Coast and the South Atlantic till Alan Phillips came along and said they were all misidentified. So if you're looking at Christmas count data, there was a severe and sudden crash in their populations in the 70s, mainly because the thousands that were being called semi-palmateds were Westerns. Semi-palmateds winter down to South America. Seen a few in winter on the Yucatan. There are a few in South Florida. There are a few other documented records, but none in the winter for California. Next image. Now, I think we have time to address some. We'll take a break in about 15 minutes, but before getting to the eye candy and the Malibu Lagoon attractions, have some questions come in, Jen?
Yes, we have some questions.
Good.
Here's one from Benjamin. I often give shorter-billed Westerns a second or third look. Is sex difference the main reason for this variation, or is it an age factor?
Yes, it's all about sex. The males have shorter bills, the females have longer bills, and indeed, the male can first glance look like a semi-palmated, but the bill still tends to thin near the tip. And to further muddle the situation for you, semi-palmateds are clinal. So fortunately, the ones we see on the West Coast are invariably pretty short-billed. But if you go to the East Coast, be alarmed by long-billed semi-palmateds. That's not, they're not recognized with trinomials, but just be aware as you go east across the breeding range, the bills gradually get longer. That's not the case in Western, which is confined as a breeder to Alaska, Chukotka, the Russian Far East. So yeah, excellent question.
And we have a question from Barbara Peck. Please say more about feeding and how they are different, the least Western and semi-palmated.
Thank you. And, it's fascinating when, the raptor, many flushes of shorebirds, there isn't a raptor. You look for the merlin or the peregrine and nothing occurs. Or maybe they saw one at a great distance. They always see them before you do. They have more of an incentive to see them before you do. But they'll all fly off and then they come back and then they resort into their own feeding territories. So leasts are often back from the edge of the water in the mud. And they're little, and because of their darker color, they're often a little harder to spot. The westerns are often out slightly into the water, and the semi-palmateds are just into the water or right along the edge of the water. Now, that's not to say they all overlap, and you can never use that as a reason to establish an identification, but just be aware of the general tendencies of feeding.
That appears to be all the questions we have right now.
That's very good. Well, let us, we still have about 10 minutes before break. So let's start with some of the eye candy, shall we call it? And redneck stint. It used to be known as the rufous neck sandpiper. If you remembered the program earlier by Phil, California's first rufous neck sandpiper, because it was a specimen, and it got re-looked at, and there was I think Veet authored an additional paper on the subject of that bird, but ultimately because of the toe pads, genetic studies showed it to be North America's first little stint. And that's much to the credit that we have archived specimens. So the redneck stint, though, it's annual in California. Nearly all of the records involve breeding adults. And all of the records, those that aren't are juveniles. The basic plumage of redneck stint is unrecorded in the New World, to my knowledge. Winters an Indian subcontinent to Australasia. A rare migrant, even rarer breeder in Western Alaska. Casual in migration over really all of North America, or most of North America, although the majority of records are from the West Coast. I should add also that on semi-palmated, the basic plumage is essentially unknown, except maybe in early spring as they winter south of the United States. So things to look for on this breeding plumage bird are the rufous throat with streaks across the breast. The bill's much like semi-palmated, but a little finer tipped. Not particularly a split supercilium, which is important from little stint. The main confusion species is little stint, but also be aware of sanderling, which is larger, lacks a hind toe. Notice the streaks are below an unmarked rufous throat. Important from sanderling. But I remember one of the first ones at the mouth of the Santa Clara River in Ventura County, when people excitedly went and saw it, and a birder went over to the beach and said, there's a flock of 30 redneck stints over there on the beach. And of course, those were sanderlings. So sanderling should always be the precursor of caution. Britain's first accepted record from Fair Isle of a redneck stint was sent to Lars Johnson, one of the world's authorities on peeps stints. And he said politely, have you thought of sanderling? The British Bird Records Committee had accepted a sanderling as their first redneck stint. So keep that in mind. It fooled the best. Next image. Another great shot. This was along the LA River, as I recall. It shows all of the features. Notice that while there is color in the scapulars, what you can see of the greater covered centertials, the edges are pretty dull, and that's important from little stint. Next image. In juvenile plumage, the redneck stint looks a lot like a semi-palmated sandpiper, little slightly longer wing tip projection, a little more of an attenuated body, but that's subtle. But they're duller than the semi-palmated, especially on the lower scapulars and the wing coverts, just grayer, and yet alone the inner scapulars are edged with rufous, as is the mantle, so a little brighter on the back. Needless to say, you need to look at any claimed juvenile redneck stint with great caution. I'm aware of, I may not be entirely right. I know that Todd Easterly found one in Yolo County, and there's a very well documented record from Riverside County. The same man, a few weeks later, found a juvenile little stint at the same location. Notice they're not a very good split supercilium and washing on the sides of the breast, but not streaking, setting up to compare to little stint. Next image. Another shot of a juvenile from St. Lawrence Island, where I believe Paul Lehman found a few annually, and they're usually annual in the spring too. Bill's a little finer than a semi-palmated, not as tubular. Next image. And here's a plumage. The redneck stint we don't see, but you can see how much it's like a semi-palmated. The ear coverts aren't as dark and accenting the supercilium, and it's a little paler gray above. But in places where semi-palmateds are in the winter, this would not stand out. I would add, this is one of the places in your lifetime you should try to get to, Pak Delay. In Thailand, it's close to 40 species of shorebirds winter here, including, we hope for decades to come, a few spoon-billed sandpipers, where this bird was photographed. Next image. And as a warning, we have a redneck stint and a sanderling. You can see where their color is on the sanderling. There's also streaking, unlike the redneck stint. The thicker, more semi-palmated sandpiper like Bill of the sanderling. If your redneck stint is running very quickly in advance and into retreating waves, that's a warning sign. Next image. Well, another look-alike and breeding plumage to the redneck stint is the spoon-billed sandpiper, or as many affectionately refer to these days, spoonies. There's a worldwide effort joined by the Chinese, the Russians, the Brits, formerly the Burmese, certainly the Thais. We hope the Burmese, once they settle their political issues, those Burma, Bangladesh, Thailand is where they winter. They breed in the northeast Russian Far East, including parts of Chukotka, Anidar. They're really trying to save this bird, which is down to a few hundred. It looks a bit like quite a lot like a redneck stint in breeding plumage. But of course, the unique bill, and they do feed a little differently. They stage in the Yellow Sea, Eastern China, and also South Korea. When they go through Hong Kong, there's the few that still do are in basic plumage. Next image. So these were two on Attu. There have been very few North American records in recent decades. Ed Greaves found these two on Attu famously in 1986 and was photographing them as redneck stints for quite a while, until as he was looking through his viewfinder, he noticed the bill shape. Ed did not have a heart attack on the spot. He was able to get the word out. And everybody saw these birds. These are Ed's photos. Next image. And here's the only way I've seen them in their basic winter-like plumage at Pak Delay. They're a little whiter faced than redneck stint, and of course the bill. Look for birds out in the water as opposed to feeding on the shore. So they tend to feed in shallow water and really do, not always, but have a slight side-to-side motion. Let's try to do little stint, and then we'll take a break. Little stint's coming up. So little stint in fresh alternate plumage, though it lacks the rufous throat, Instead you see, but it's brighter above. Look how bright those tertial edges are and the greater coverts edged with bright rufous. You see the median coverts there too. They're edged with rufous. So they appear brighter above than a redneck stint, but they lack the red throat, have red in the ear coverts. The bill tends to be a little finer tip. They tend to be a little longer legged, and many, I don't see it on this individual, have more of a split supercilium. Next image. Here's one from Lesbos, late April, not fully into breeding plumage, but often the first feathers molted are the tertials in March and April. And look at how black centered they are with a bright wide rufous edge, unlike redneck stint. It also shows on the median coverts. That one has a thicker tip bill. Little stints, well, the first record for North America was now in the one that was collected by Guy McCaskey in 1974. The first one in breeding plumage was 1976, but they're equally as numerous as redneck stint California, annual. And recently they've been found, one or two have wintered at the southern end of San Diego Bay, the salt ponds there. And Gene Cardiff collected one in the Mojave Desert in November, a bird which might have been attempting to winter. So winter seems in the realm of possibility, but probably not very likely for redneck stint. And it's recorded coast to coast. Of course, is found all the way across Eurasia. And recently, a breeding at least attempt from northern Alaska. Next image. Now look how different. It gets a little trickier when they come back in late summer. Here's one from Edwards. Look at the underparts pattern isn't quite as obvious. It's still with a white throat, but that color is suffusing well into the breast. So it gives you pause, but then look at all the pattern on the coverts and the tertials, all black centered with rufous edges and pretty distinctive. Next image. Comparison of alternate little and redneck stints. Summarizing the features we talked about. Both now from July. So we're comparing apples and apples. Look at the difference in the upper parts and the difference in the underparts. Little stint, this tends to show, this one at least, more of the split supercilium, a second pale stripe that goes from about above the eye, which tends to be more lacking in redneck stint. Next image. Now mirroring the features of the breeding plumage, the little stint has black centered coverts, often with the tertials, all with a chestnutty edge, giving a bright appearance, tending more towards the split supercilium. And an additional feature to look for, look at the streaking or the spotting, dark spotting on the sides of the breast that's blurrier in redneck stint. From Jerry Mizell on Attu in 1983. Next image. And a comparison of a juvenile redneck stint on the right with the little stint on the left. They look very similar. So I think at this point, we'll answer questions and then take a break. Jen, more questions coming in?
Yes, we have one from Calvin. The question is, I regularly see least sandpipers foraging on rocky jetties.
Yes.
Occasionally with a western or two. Do other peeps forage in this way?
You know, I guess I would say there are always exceptions. Birds are going to, including calidris, are going to go to where the food is. I remember a ruff that wintered on a rock jetty, hardly feeding grounds for a ruff. So, but least habitually use rock jetties to feed. You know, you think of rock jetties, you think of black turnstones, you think of surf birds. But yes, least will use it too. And that dark background of the jetty, they tend to blend in or hard to see. So good question. Westerns, less so. Westerns, I think they're a little less Catholic in their habitat feeding choices.
That's the only question in the Q&A. I'm going to check the chat really quickly and see what's there.
Okay.
In the chat, it's just people gushing at how beautiful the presentation is, which it is. It's beautifully done.
Well, thank you. Thank Laura. Thank Larry for the beautiful images he's gotten, which we're able to talk about. And we will continue. You know, we've done most of the program. We'll just see how much time we have, whether we have any time for dowitchers. But thinking of Bryce's lessons of a slow go, I still hope to try my hand with additional images over the future with Bryce's tutelage. I think we'll take, it's now I'm coming up on 5:50, 5 minutes. I'll come back, be ready in 3 or 4. If there are any questions, additional questions, I can address them then, and then we'll carry on to the remaining stints and then get to some of the larger calidris like Baird's white-rumped pectoral and sharp-tailed. Thank you all for your rapt attention. And I'll be back. 5 minutes. Let's go to the next image. So what can we say about long-toed stint? It's regular, particularly in the spring, on the islands in the Bering Sea, particularly the westernmost Aleutians, where numbers have occurred on occasion. I don't believe there's an acceptable record for mainland Alaska, maybe one for the Seward Peninsula. There are 2 well-documented records in fall from around the 1st of September, one from Oregon, Northwest Oregon, one from Moss Landing. That's not right. Salinas sewage ponds found by Brian Daniels, both juveniles. I would have suspected there would have been more. Now here's a basic plumage bird, the way you see them in the fall, in winter, late fall and winter. And they look a lot like a least sandpiper. Their call's a little coarser, legs are a little brighter. I know I told you not to look at the legs, but that's the way it goes. The key field mark on long-toed stint is the head pattern. The dark comes down the forehead and pinches off a very prominent white supercilium. That's the key. Or put another way, there's a dark J lying at a funny angle. You can see the curve. It pinches off the white supercilium, unlike least. That is the single best feature. An additional, more minor character is most have a pale base to the lower mandible. That holds for all plumages. So that combined with the call. Forget about you trying to see the toes, which in this case you're not seeing anyway. And least is kind of long-toed. You'll get in trouble very, very quickly going along, getting caught up on that. What else can I say? Let's go to the next image. So just 2 records for the West Coast, both the juveniles. Here's Britain's, as it turns out, the 2nd record of long-toed stint for Britain. It overall is a little brighter. Look at those mantle V's on the juvenile long-toed. But your attention should be, you might look at quickly that the legs have a pretty strongly yellow, but then I told you not to look at the legs. So go to the head pattern and look how the supercilium is cut off. That classic J. The bill is possibly a little straighter than a least sandpiper and yellowish at the base of the lower mandible, it shows. Look, now let's look at the tertials. The tertials are quite brightly edged, as are the greater secondary coverts. But then go to the medians, 1 row up. Distinct white edges and that are contrasty. And least there, it's all pretty uniform on the wing coverts. I realize we're taking this apart pretty carefully. The point is, if you're claiming a long-toed stint in California, you really need to have your coverts in a row before making the claim. Next image. Now, some leasts are brighter than this one, but this gives you, or many leasts are a little brighter. Should have found a brighter image perhaps, but here's that long-toed stint in comparison with the least. And the primary thing, in addition to the wing coverts, but look at the way the supercilium crosses the forehead rather than being strongly pinched off. The bill of a least is slightly decurved, normally entirely dark. And then listen for the calls. Leasts have a pretty high-pitched wee call. Long-toed is heading off towards Baird's. Next image. Another comparison of another least sandpiper with the Monterey long-toed stint. So this is, to date, California's only long-toed stint. And you can see the diagnostic face pattern. Next image. Now, Temix is kind of an oddball stint. And by the way, the genetic relationships within the seven deadly stints have been rearranged a bit. Long-toed and least sandpiper are not each other's closest relatives, nor are little and redneck stints. And the genus Calidris has been greatly expanded. And that was about 10 years ago, or a little less. So spoon-billed sandpiper was in its own genus. No more, it's a Calidris. Broad-billed sandpiper in its own genus. No more, Calidris. And others, even the ruff, a Calidris, buff-breasted Calidris, broad-billed, now a Calidris. And even the surfbird in its own genus is a Calidris. So the terms of Calidris have changed. And but here's Temix, kind of an oddball, has a really peculiar rattled call, a trill, a rattled note, like winding a watch, if we remembered what those were. They have white outer tail feathers, which can be apparent in flight. But in basic plumage, like the way you see them in the winter in Thailand, they're washed with gray, give the effect much like a winter plumage spotted sandpiper for us, or a common sandpiper for Europeans. They obviously don't bob like that. And they're very unpatterned, very smooth. Named after a Dutch ornithologist, Temminck, who's served as the curator for 4 decades, much as the way Phil detailed earlier today for some of the curators, including himself at the San Diego Natural History Museum. Next image. In breeding plumage, they don't have a noticeable primary projection past the tertials, but they have a Baird's-like sort of scallop pattern above. They're basically brownish, but with various scattered blackish subterminal marks, broad subterminal marks on the scapulars. They're good about calling. Now, the only records Temminck stand is regular in Western Alaska. They breed close to St. Lawrence Island in Chukotka. And there are 2 records away from Western Alaska, both in the Pacific Northwest, a typical juvenile bird in southern British Columbia around the 1st of September, and a later bird in Northwest Washington later in the fall, and I don't remember the plumage it was in. But just 2. None of the other claims are substantiated with documentary evidence. Next image. Now, the juvenile plumage is the easiest plumage to identify. And the oddball, you know, the temix is different in so many ways, but I have a red knot-like pattern of subterminal black edges on all of those feathers above that makes it really apparent. And there's a good chance if we were to get a temix stint in California or elsewhere in the West, it would be in juvenile plumage. And it'd be easy to separate provided the photos are good enough to see those subterminal dark fringes. It's a red knot-like pattern, unique amongst the small calidris. Remember, the two knots are calidris too. Next image. So we'll now go to some of the larger calidris, big peeps, or however we want to characterize this. And we're just talking about Bairds. Bairds, the adults, most of them go up through the western and central Great Plains, some to the Great Basin. They're rare west and east of that. What they see in the east, what we primarily see on the west coast, are juveniles that begin appearing in August, with decent numbers all through September. Moderate size. This is not the best image to show this, but considerable primary tip projection that goes past the tail. And those sort of black-centered scapulars. I see very few in the spring, although could see many. If I went to like Kansas or Central Texas, that's the way the majority of the adults migrate. Joseph Argel was the first, to my knowledge, to detail the different migration patterns in the adults and the juveniles. And you could say the same for other species too. Buff-breast spread out more to both coasts. But each species is different. Learn the distribution patterns with both the adults and the juveniles. Next image. The juveniles are really beautiful, scaly, nice fringes around each feather, a light buffy color. Here you can see the very long primary tip projection past the tertials. And this is what we mainly see now. Virtually all of the Bairds now are juveniles that we're seeing in California, which is why they're now at peak abundance. If you went to eastern Colorado or Kansas in July, you would have seen lots and lots of Bairds, and they would have been adults, at least up till the last few days. They winter in South America, mainly the western part, but not the northmost part, so a little different from white-rumped. Next image. And speaking of which, shaped very much like a Baird's, not as brown, extensively streaked down the sides and flanks, grayer underneath, long primary projection about the size of Baird's. Wingtips project past the tail. They, most, but not all, but most show a bit of pinkish or pale at the base of the lower mandible. Fairly good supercilium. They have Baird's has a low scratchy call. White-rumped has one of the highest pitch calls of a calidris. Now, the migration of these, they're one of the latest arriving calidris, not till late April or after the middle of April on the Gulf Coast, where they have come from their southern South American winter grounds. They go all the way to Tierra del Fuego. So they arrived, the earliest one I ever saw on the upper Texas coast was the 17th of April. And they peak in late May. And they're still migrating through, at least through the Midwest, Great Plains in mid-June. I saw one, I believe, on the 26th of June that was still a spring migrant in southern Manitoba. So very late spring migrant. The few we see in the West, well, particularly California, they're probably annual in Southeast Arizona, certainly New Mexico, Colorado, very small numbers. Probably annual in California. I mean, this spring there were 3 at Baker in late May, the Baker sewage ponds. And the overwhelming majority of records in California are adults in the spring, or spring birds. Plumage like this. There are a scattering of fall records. Every single one of them is an adult. And every single record of a white rump in the West, certainly that I know of, probably west of the Mississippi anyway, are also adults. The juveniles, as in sharp-tailed, flee east. I think a lot of the juveniles migrate out over the Atlantic. I have seen a juvenile in Alabama in mid-October, and a few juveniles on Lake Erie in Northeast Ohio. The others I've seen in the Midwest were all adults in the fall, I'm speaking of. So this is kind of, I don't think it's fully appreciated. I wish Easterners would report more on the white rumps they see in the fall. Maybe I'm unaware of some of the juvenile reports. But basically, if you're claiming a juvenile white rump in California, first thing you'll hear is there are no records of that age class. Juveniles are very late as well, not till the end of September, even from the Northeast, where most that do get recorded get seen. And they're still coming through in early December. They breed in the very high Arctic, the Canadian Arctic archipelago, a few south to north slope of Alaska, but not many. Next image. Here's one from, I believe it's Churchill, still a spring migrant on the 16th of June. Remember the shape, size, all suggestive of Baird's. The white rump is a field mark you can see in flight, and the rump is usually not solidly white anyway, but certainly whiter than a Baird's or most of the other calidras. So it's a good field mark in flight, as is that high-pitched call. Sadly, high-pitched is deadly for me. I listened to Neil Young a little too much, his electric stuff, rather than Leonard Cohen. So the high-pitched notes are largely lost, even with hearing aids. In fact, that would be a good field mark for me. If it's not calling repeatedly, maybe it's white rump. Little rufous above, little pink at the base of the lower mandible. Next image. This, I believe, is the first record of an adult for California in the fall. It's in worn alternate plumage. It stayed, I believe, from 15 to 22 August, but since there have been a few more. You can see the very long primary projection. And that one, I remember, it was the call that alerted me to its presence. Next image. This is the ones from the Bahamas. No, this one's Ohio. So even though they go all the way to southern South America, white-rumped adults are seen in full basic plumage, like this one. Notice the cowled look with the distinct supercilium. So a distinct gray breast. Look at the wingtip projection. Or primary tip projection, sorry. The gray wash across the breast and distinct supercilium. Next image. And here's, I believe this photo is from Claudia Wilds, late Claudia Wilds, who taught us so much about dowitchers. She loved shorebirds too. This is the plumage. You basically have to go to the Northeast to see. The Maritimes would be a good place, or Newfoundland. Look how long the primary projection is, past the tertials, mirroring the breeding plumage of the adult in terms of the upper parts, little pinkish at the base of the bill. And remember, to my knowledge, no documented records for Western North America of this age class. Next image. Pectoral sandpiper. Now here is the plumage we don't often see. More in adult, they're rare in the spring. Adults are very uncommon in the fall. What we see are juveniles late August through much of October. The adults primarily go through the Midwest, the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. And that's why if you 4th of July weekend in Ohio, if the conditions are right, there can be lots of pectorals. which came as a shock to me coming from California, but that's because we see very few adults. So the adults have a very easterly, well, most west of the Appalachians, but not on the plains so much. And they go up to the Arctic and breed from northern Canada across and across much of the, certainly the Russian Far East and into Siberia. So 2,500, 3,000 miles west of Alaska. And then they have to retrace all of that, head to Hudson Bay, other 3,000, and then south to Argentina. So for at least those few, they get the Globetrotter Award, in my opinion. They start arriving in March, even early March in Texas. Big numbers come through. By the end of April, most have already gone through where the pulse arrives on the Gulf Coast in South Texas. They have a nice broad band of streaks across the breast. They're bigger than the Baird's, appear rather striped. They'll have the long primary projection, and the legs are pretty yellow. They tend to be out in the water a bit, slightly different substrates on average than Baird's. More marshy vegetation. At the premier spots in California for juveniles in the fall, there can be triple-digit counts, but we normally think of pectoral as fairly uncommon. Next image. Here's the way we see our classic juvenile pectorals. Quite bright above. Remember, they're striped above. Braces on the sides of the back, not scaly like a juvenile Baird's. You can see the long primary tip projection past the tertials. Streak neck. Heavy streaks. Now, some can be brighter than that, and they can have a rufous cap. And you might be getting optimistic about sharp-tailed. I mean, when you're looking at pecs, you've seen pectorals, and then you see a bright one. Wouldn't it be nice to round out the day with a juvenile sharp-tailed sandpiper? But think this, wherever there's streaks, that will be the buffy suffusion. Sharp-tailed shows distinct buff below the neck pattern of streaks, and as well as being a brighter bird overall. Here again, pectoral and sharp-tailed are not each other's sister species. Next image. Here's a comparison of the juvenile pectoral and the Baird's. See, one is scaly, the other appears more striped. One is a little darker, one is a little paler. Next image. This brings us to sharp-tailed. Now, this plumage is only very rarely seen in North America, but there are some records of birds in this plumage from the lower 48, including California. So the pattern, it's more arrow-shaped chevrons on the sides, more distinct flank streaking. It's brighter above. The eye-ring stands out quite prominently. Brighter rufous, and certainly a rufous cap. Sharp-tailed sandpiper is the one Asian species where the juveniles have a migration pattern like white rump. They flee east. So the overwhelming majority that gets seen in Alaska, probably 99% or more, are juveniles, as well as for the east coast of Asia. Adults have more of an interior route. This has been well detailed by Tomkovich and others. Next image. And a juvenile sharp-tail. Now see the streaks on the neck, and below that is bright buff. So where the buff is, there's no streaks. This is exciting news. The cap tends to be brighter rufous. The supercilium tends to be bolder. The eye-ring tends to be bolder. The tertial edges tend to be broader and brighter. And a few more streaks on the undertail and sides, and they call differently. Although I think sharp tails on the whole tend to be a little quieter, at least the few strays I've watched in California. Maybe that's because we're very careful not to flush them. It makes birders that come along and you point to the distant sky where you flush the bird because you wanted to hear it call, and you get glared at. It's not, you always need to think of the ethics here. Next image. And sharp-tailed and a pectoral together. Just review the marks. Averaging slightly redder cap, slightly bolder eye-ring, slightly bolder rufous-edged tertials, but the best way are the underparts. So that is the end of the calidris. We certainly do not have time for dowitchers. Let's take a few questions. Maybe Lara could show herself. We can
Lara is showing herself, yes.
See what Laura's computer saved image is.
Okay.
I would thank both Alex and Lara for working very closely together on our programs. And I'll just say the youth have played a major role in our virtual conference. Please support their programs at all levels. And I thank them and others for their programs and for their help, and they deserve to be supported. There are other groups that support them too, of course, Lab S, the Central Valley, ABA, that have active youth programs. I don't mean to obscure anybody, but the area you live may have students. If they don't, if you know students, perhaps you can send them to areas that they can find a home and support. Lara, are you there?
No, I'm here.
Ah, there's a new virtual image. Which one is that, Lara?
It's Bob's surfbird chick.
Ah, so a surfbird chick. Remember, it's a calidris now. That's just the way I see surfbirds at Marina del Rey, right? No, maybe not. It's a beautiful image. And thank you for the help. And Lara throughout was moving that cursor to get all those feather tracks and the key field marks and put together design, including with the artistry of the program. So I think we may have a little time to answer questions, Jen. I don't want to, how many more?
There are 3 questions.
Okay.
And they all appear to be quite technical.
Yes.
So hopefully I can interpret them so that you can answer them.
All right.
Barbara asks, the image of the long-toed in Monterey versus the least. So she's referring to a particular slide. And she's saying, did I see a J pinching off the supercilium in the least? The image went by too fast.
I don't know. Let's answer the other 2 questions and then see if we can go back to that image. It would have been, the comparison would have been image number 44.
Wow. Okay, Lara.
Or,
if you can get
no,
that
45.
And then we can bring it up. I'll ask the other questions. Lena asks, can you repeat the name of the other adult sandpiper that we see in California besides the WRSA?
The other adult white rump sandpiper was we have seen only adults. I mean, any white rumped in California is very exciting, but all of the records to date have involved adults. No records of juveniles.
All right. And then Lena also asks or states, sharp-tailed and pectoral seem to have that J or pinched look of the little stint.
I mean, the J of the long-toed stint, perhaps.
Oh, the long-toed. Yeah.
Well, that may be, but they're both, almost either one of them could eat a long-toed stint. The size different, and I'm of course being facetious, but they're both larger than long-toed. The comparison you want to make is here between, I think that may be shadow, Barbara. So let's look carefully at that supercilium. It's really bold. And just before it's going to cross, suddenly it gets pitched off by the dart coming down the forehead and then circling into the front part of the lores, hence the J. Whereas on least, supercilium, maybe there's a few more streaks in there. It doesn't jump out as much, but it gets broader as you get in front of the eye and goes right across the forehead. And I think that shadow that you're seeing that seems to be pinching it off. At least that's the way I'm going to interpret it. And I can't go back and look at it because it was a while ago, like 31, 32 years. Any other things to add? If you can see it, Laura's program on Dunlands, she's invested a lot of time with an Ohlone Audubon. If it's still archived, Dunland systematics are utterly fascinating, and it's circumpolar, and there are 10 subspecies, and there's so much to learn.
All right. I think that's the last of the questions. So I'm going to bring John Harris back in, and he can tell us about what's coming up.
Before you cut me off, again, note that the corrections that Susan made on lab. They believe in open access to all, free and open access, so those programs are readily available. And the correction on the Tringa program, Andrew Birch did that. Anything else, John, you need from me before I sign off?
No, that's great, John. Thanks very much to John and Lara. I was thinking that maybe if somebody could put the link for Lara's Ohlone Audubon program in the chat, we can leave that for a while and people can get that link. We'll be on break till 7 o'clock, and then we'll have our final program, which will be Dr. Morgan Tingley talking about fire and birds. So see you all.